Okay, I think we should go ahead and get started. I've given it 10 minutes. What do you think?
Yeah, it sounds good. We can even start by going around a little bit with intros, just to get warmed up, and then we can get into the presentation.
Wow, that's your style. Okay, let's get started. Thank you so much, Najiba Akbar, for joining us. As we present to you the last series of this last session of this series, I'm so excited that we have you here today. Najiba serves as the Muslim chaplain at Tufts University in Boston, and she's also the spiritual advisor at Northeastern. Previously, she was a chaplain at Wellesley College. She also has her private coaching practice that helps people develop greater self-awareness and discover their unique purpose in this world. Her current podcast, Muslim Enneagram, explores the connection between Islam and the ancient Enneagram symbol, which is set to be a roadmap for the journey of the soul towards the divine essence. On a personal level, she's the kind of friend who shows up when your kids are sick and you're sick and takes over. So I am so honored to host you, and I appreciate you taking the time out to be with us. Turning it over to you. Thank you so much. And I think more people will trickle in with the time change. Is just now Maghrib Salah, so that is throwing some people off. I'm getting some messages. But I think, let's get started, whatever.
Thank you, Shima, for inviting me and including me in this lineup that you have. It was a wonderful lineup of presenters and topics that you've all put together. So, mashallah. I'd love to know if you could put into the chat what are the ages of your kids, if you do have kids, because that'll just help me get a sense of what some of the kind of current needs are in the audience, because, having toddlers is different than having teenagers and all that. And some of us, may have kids of various ages or no kids, but just want to get a sense of who is in the audience, inshallah. Okay, yeah, so I'll let that come in slowly. Okay, awesome. So thanks for the introduction. So I wanted to just start, Bismillah, with my intention of being with you tonight is, this is a work in progress for me. So as I continue to learn and teach about this subject, it also helps me with my own character development and my own ability to see my kids, to stop and reflect, and to step out of automatic behaviors. And that's some of what my focus will be on tonight in talking about what does it mean to get present with our children. And this is the same quality that it would take to get present with ourselves in our own lives, get present with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's scholars who say that, we can only really experience Allah's love and his presence when we become present. Whenever we're not present, we're away from Allah. And whenever we're present, we're with him. And the same goes for our kids. When we're present with them, we can be present to the beauty that they're bringing to our lives and to the world, just the beauty that children bring with their essence and their fitrah and their innocence. When we're not present with ourselves or not present with them, then we can become blind to that. And we're all human beings, and so none of us is in a state of constant, complete presence. So that's why we're constantly making tawbah and trying to come back to Allah and bring ourselves back to presence, which is, why for me, I am so grateful that Allah gave us these homework assignments of daily prayer and, Ramadan coming in the middle of every year, because without these things, like surely we would stray far away from being present with Allah, being present with ourselves, and doing this work of constant self-development that I really believe is the essence and the purpose of Islam, the essence and purpose of all of the revealed religions that Allah revealed for us to constantly be reminded and warned, right? So all the prophets were sent to remind us, send us the good news, and send us the warning. So for me, dealing with children is a microcosm of our ability to work on ourselves and bring our best selves into the world. And, I know for all of us who are either moms or dads here, we have that intention of wanting to be the best parents that we can, wanting to raise the best kids that we can. But with that can come a lot of fear, confusion, and anxiety about how to do that, what it looks like, how to shape our children, in the right way and how to keep them away from bad influences around them. So hopefully this presentation will just give you some new food for thought, maybe some new lenses to look at yourself and others, and just provide a way to just kind of look at things with a new eye, which is always helpful, inshallah. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so this is the presentation I have up. I may or may not go through the whole thing. We have until 8 o'clock, right, Shima? Yeah, okay. And
yeah,
you know,
if people have questions, if you have time, we can.
yeah, I'm happy to stay after because the discussion part's really nice too. So I'll do the presentation, leave some time at the end, and then I can stay a little bit afterwards for anyone who wants to
Perfect.
stay.
And if people have questions, they can type it in the Q&A and I can read it towards the end.
Yeah, sure. Sounds good. So I'm going to go through some of the content that I have, and then inshallah we can have discussion as well. So the presentation is working with your child's unique personality, and I chose an image of fingerprints just as a reminder that, you know, Allah made each human being with a different fingerprint, so that should just give us a sense of how diverse humankind is, that Allah chose to give us each a unique fingerprint or unique voice, just a completely unique identity, and for us to reflect on that and what does that mean and why did he do that. So just a general concept of why is it important, for example, to study something like personality or archetypes. I only started studying this about 10 years ago. I did study some psychology when I was in high school and college, but generally self-knowledge, which is highly valued in Islam. You know, there's a saying that he who knows himself knows his Lord, from Al-Ghazali. So if we know ourselves, we have a better sense of what are our core motivations and fears. And so, you know, we like to think that our core motivation is always having a good intention, wanting to please Allah. But from a psychological perspective, sometimes our core motivations are that we're really scared, or, you know, we really want to be seen, or we really want to stay safe. Or it could be a number of things. So looking at what are our core motivations when we're acting, what fears do we have, what are our thought and behavior patterns, which all of us have different ones, you know, how the kind of thoughts that we think throughout the day, how we typically behave with others, ultimately, what is our impact on others? So there's, you know, a lot of talk these days about what's called like intention versus impact. So we might have a certain intention, but we also have to look at how our way of showing up actually impacts others. So that can apply to our children as well. And then what are our blind spots, right? So the more we study ourselves, study our personality, we might notice that there's things that we're not paying attention to, or things that we just, you know, we're ignoring in the past, but that are actually really important. And of course, studying personality and archetypes and psychology generally can help us understand others so that we can respond with more love and compassion to others. We can practice humility because we realize that we struggle with a lot of things, with a lot of behaviors that we find it hard to change. So then you can also be compassionate with a child or someone else who's struggling to change, and ultimately accepting differences. So, you know, this doesn't mean necessarily that we accept behaviors that, you know, we deem as wrong or that need to be corrected, but differences in how we show up, how we speak, how we interact with others. So one thing I want to emphasize, you know, I'm going to go through some different personality and temperament ideas. There's no right or wrong temperament or personality, contrary to, you know, popular opinion or our own opinions. Each one is unique and contains qualities that must be harnessed, pruned, and developed into their highest form. And this is the purpose of striving for prophetic character. So these are just my own words, my own ideas, but basically what I'm trying to convey is that sometimes we fall into this habit of basically putting people into categories of, okay, this is a good personality or a good temperament or a good way to be, and this other temperament or personality, you know, is bad and needs to be stamped out or controlled or in some way kind of eliminated. And so this is not a good way to look at temperament and personality. Now, this is very different from talking about character. So we're not talking about our character, our values, our ethics. These are things that, you know, Islam has clear teachings about. We're talking right now about temperament and personality, which is different from that. So if we pay attention and get curious, we can step back and see who our child really is rather than who we want them to be. So this is the exercise I want to encourage us to engage in, is getting curious about why our children are the way they are, why they say the things they say, some of their behaviors that might be confusing, that are different than us, maybe different than others in our family. This quality of curiosity is really important because it prevents us from jumping to conclusions and jumping to judgment, and rather trying to understand what's going on behind a behavior. If we dig beneath the surface of our reactivity with our kids, we'll uncover our own childhood wounds. So we won't get too much into this today, just a little bit, but we may notice that we have a tendency to be reactive with those around us, particularly our own family members, our kids. And reactivity means that something happens and we quickly jump to a certain behavior. So, it could be frustration or anger or answering a certain way, or just responding in a certain way that feels like a knee-jerk reaction. And so if we learn about ourselves more, we can start to understand what that's all about, what is getting triggered that makes us react, and what does it have to do with our own childhood wounds, which means like how we may have been treated when we were a child, or just our issues that we are bringing into the situation that we may not be aware of. So ultimately, I want to just emphasize that everyone can learn new strategies to support, understand, and encourage their children. It's not about being the perfect patient mother or father, that nobody can be that perfect angel. Everyone can learn new strategies to support, understand, and encourage their children, as long as you have a commitment to getting curious, paying attention, withholding reactivity. And these are all things that we should do in our lives in general, if we want to be on that path, the Islamic path of like self-transformation and self-improvement, rather than being in the camp of people who say, well, I am how I am and I can't change, because I think Islam comes to show us that we can change if we exert effort into developing ourselves, developing our character. And if we free ourselves from old frameworks, we can create more opportunities for love, connection, and presence. So what I mean by old frameworks is maybe basically ideas or beliefs that we may have or carry, from our past or from whatever places that we pick them up from. Sometimes those kind of hold us hostage, so we keep thinking about things in a certain way and interpreting things in a certain way. If we're able to examine that, we can free ourselves from some of these older frameworks and just create more opportunities to get present. So I'm going to share this diagram with you first. So this is something called temperament. Just quick show of hands. Has anyone studied temperament? Okay, a couple of people. So I have not studied this particular model in depth, but this is one that is used a lot. If you listen to Hamza Yusuf, he'll talk about these different temperaments and place himself and others, in these different categories, and talk about the importance of knowing your temperament, especially when you think about, Islam's focus on wrestling with our own nafs and wrestling with our ego and knowing what our desires are, and, really taking steps to kind of push back on our ego self. It's really important to know your temperament. And so you'll see here that some of these characteristics, when you look at them, you might naturally feel that some of them are good characteristics and some of them are bad. So just some quick participation. What are some of the ones that sound like good characteristics to you when you're reading them? You can just call out which ones seem good to you, or which colors.
Blue.
Blue and red sometimes. Yeah, I agree.
Blue and red.
Sometimes.
Yeah, so blue has a lot of the things that are evoked these days in terms of, just like the yogic philosophy, or like, being calm and being centered. So peaceful, thoughtful, even-tempered. Usually people don't have problems with these characteristics. And then on the left side,
I'm red. I was gonna say that. I was reading it. I'm definitely red.
Yeah, so when you look at red, these are actually characteristics that are very much encouraged in Western society. If you think about leadership and helping children be outgoing, sociable, talkative, responsive, even carefree is like kind of pointed to as a positive thing if you think about Western culture and music, movies, this idea of like not being too stoic or too serious, being carefree. But now when you come down here, you'll start to see some of the qualities that we may try to get away from, or maybe we don't like to see in others or ourselves. So we come down here, you know, impulsive, aggressive, restless, touchy, then moody, anxious, rigid, pessimistic, unsociable, quiet, under melancholic. So this is just an example of how they have these different characteristics. You know, traditionally, these were the 4 temperaments that people were divided into. And then there was different exercises that people from different temperaments needed to do to balance themselves, right? So if you're too excitable and aggressive, you need to do something to calm yourself and maybe become more peaceful. Whereas maybe if you're too phlegmatic and you have low energy and you're too calm, maybe you need to do something to bring you over this way so that you can, you know, rev yourself up and get the energy to act in the world or to take care of your body or exercise. Or if, you know, if you're too positive, maybe you're not paying attention to moments where you might need to be more melancholic, you might need to be more sober, you might need to look at the dark matter in life, or maybe grieve over something that you've lost. And so if we look at these characteristics more carefully, we'll see that actually it's not necessarily good and bad. It has to do with what might be called for in a certain situation. And there's actually a need for this balance of different temperaments as we're looking at a family or a society, you know, an entire society that only has one temperament. Like, you can see how that would become unbalanced, and why it's needed for there to be this circle. So this is just one example of temperament. You can definitely study this by, you know, picking up a book on temperament or listening to some of Hamza Yusuf's talks on this. But I'm going to go to this next slide, which is, so this is more my area of specialty. So I stumbled upon the Enneagram maybe like 10 years ago, and then just fell in love with it and have been studying it ever since. So this is another model of human behavior and temperament, but from my view, it's based in a model of spirituality. So it's looking at, you know, why did our ego structure come into be? And then where did it get stuck? And what do we need to do to get unstuck? So the idea is not necessarily that you stay at one of these points, but that as a child, you ended up developing a personality based on your environment and just how you came into the world. And part of your goal, part of your growth journey is to recognize, you know, how is your ego playing into your personality, and what can you do to, I would say, like, almost go beyond that. So not to get stuck in any one of these role plays or characteristics, but to truly develop the kind of raw material that you come with. So this is just one diagram. There's many diagrams like this on the internet. This is the podcast that I do that Shima mentioned. So it's called Muslim Enneagram. A friend and I, who both discovered this system around the same time, we decided to do this podcast together. So we basically talk about the whole circle, what are the different types, how we can use it for personal growth, and, you know, the theoretical underpinnings being from concepts from Tasawwuf and Islam. So we also look at the personalities of well-known Sahaba. So looking at, you know, how these Sahaba were important and how they each played different roles and had different personalities, and then share insights for growth and development. And we also connect it back to the 99 names of Allah. So looking at how, you know, we as human beings can look at the qualities of Allah and learn something and connect it back to our own way of being in the world. So if you're interested in this, you can also look me up on Spotify and listen to the podcast that's on there. So for today, I wanted to just talk about a few different concepts. So one, which we talked about a little bit earlier, is how can we see our children with fresh eyes? And so these are just some ideas that I had around kind of getting out of our reactive or current bodies. So for example, imagining yourself as a butterfly flying to the corner of the room and observing them. And I learned this from reading a book actually called Buddhism for Mothers when I first had kids. And it's a really amazing practice. So you're basically just sitting in your room doing something. You may be interacting with your kids, or maybe you don't, but you imagine yourself flying up out of yourself, going off into the corner of the room, and then just observing as if you're like, a fly on the wall. And sometimes when you do that, you are able to create this other consciousness. So you're not in your own thoughts and feelings and, the jumble of like emotions and thoughts that we always carry with us, but you allow yourself to almost observe yourself and others. And sometimes when you do this, you might feel an overwhelming sensation of emotion. It's kind of like, if you were to all of a sudden be on the outside of a window on a snowy day and just looking in and seeing your children like inside the house playing, and you were outside. Sometimes when we're observing others from that little bit of distance, it gives us a chance to see with fresh eyes rather than seeing from within that container. And our containers are cloudy, right? Because we're not fully realized human beings, so we're always seeing people through our own lenses and our own judgments. So that's one exercise that you can try. Another one that I thought of was looking at our children as they sleep. I'm sure many of us do this already, or maybe if our kids are older, we stop doing this. But I think it's really important to constantly kind of come back to our children's innocence, just remembering how they were born in innocence, and how, sometimes we project our ideas and judgments onto them. And so for us to see their innocence is a really important part of our being able to interact with them in the best way. And finally, asking them questions, listening with curiosity and not judgment. So these are all practices that you can think about or try. Just hang on one second, there's a little bit of noise on my end.
This is so good. I never thought about looking at them from like a perspective that you haven't before.
I think what happens, Shima, is we get busy with our lives now. So we're more concerned about what they're going to eat and when they're going to sleep and homework, hua ke nahi hua, all that, and not what we really need to look at.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Because I mean, all this sounds nice to do when you have extra time, right? But we don't have, extra time. So it's like consciously cultivating. And that's why I think the practice of prayer is so important, right? Like prayer forces us to literally drop everything and stop. And we have to do it, because imagine if Allah said, pray to me whenever you have time to pray. Like, he knew that was not going to work. He actually commanded us to pray at certain times. And so that practice of stopping and just allowing ourselves to actually make our bodies still, particularly in today's culture, we don't allow ourselves moments of stillness. So we're constantly, on the run for ourselves, on the run for our kids. Our days are filled with activities. So sometimes we can lose that essence that we can only experience. Sometimes our child gets hurt, and then, all of a sudden we drop everything, right? And we just tend to them, and that's all that matters in the world. Or, the experience of when you first hold your baby and the world stops, like, we forget about those things. So these are some ways that, we can try and just kind of stop. And it could just be something you're doing in your mind for a moment, but it can kind of flip the switch. And I'll share another example from another book in a moment. So I wanted to mention this. So something that is really important to me is honoring diversity in the human family. And I really want to tie it into what we're talking about today. So we may know this verse: we created you from a single pair of a male and a female, and made you into nations and tribes, that you may know each other, not that you may despise each other. Verily, the most honored of you in the sight of Allah is he who is the most righteous of you. So I'm mentioning this verse because for me, this verse talks about how Allah created diversity on purpose. He could have made us all the same language, the same culture, but he chose to make us different so that we may know each other. When I first learned the Enneagram, it blew my mind, because all of a sudden I realized how different people were wired and how differently we interacted, from how we speak to how we think the world works to what we think our job is in the world. And I'd never thought about all those things before, because I had this idea in my mind of, this box of like, this is what a good person looks like. And it was some of those characteristics that were in, for example, the blue, when we were looking at the temperaments, you know, always calm, always easygoing, always peaceful. You know, I thought that there was this one sort of way that made sense. And, you know, I would even project that onto the idea of prophetic character, like, okay, this is the way that a person is supposed to be. But when I learned the different temperaments and the different personalities, it all of a sudden struck me that, oh, there's actually many ways to be. And, you know, it's not that one is right or wrong. It depends how you use your temperament, how you use your personality. You can use it for good or you can use it for bad. But just because you are one of them, it doesn't make you better or worse. So I wanted to emphasize, you know, this concept of good kid versus bad kid. Sometimes, you know, we may even joke about it, like, oh, like, you know, this one of my kids is so easy and this one of my kids is so hard. So we tend to have perceptions of good and bad, which are affected by our own temperament and personality. So, you know, if we're someone who doesn't like a lot of excitement and noise, we might not like it if our kid is very rowdy and loud, or vice versa. You know, if we're someone who always wants to be on the move, we may not like a kid who always wants to like be by themselves and read a book or something like that. So our lens is also going to affect how we view our kids, our culture. So what does our culture say about good and bad behavior? Our own upbringing, you know, what did our parents tell us, or how did they expect us to behave? Societal views around us, what is society saying about what parents should be like, what kids should be like, and our ideas about religion and virtue. So like I mentioned, you know, as a Muslim, you know, I had certain ideas about religion or virtue that were limited to like this one category of, you know, these are characteristics that I think are good, but I wasn't necessarily leaving room for some of the other characteristics, you know, or in our religious communities, we might emphasize certain types of people or characteristics for whatever reason in the time and place that we live. We might focus on that a lot. So this is something from, there's a book called Raising Your Spirited Child. Has anyone read that book? Anyone have a spirited child? So I wanted to pull this out as well. Words matter, reframing old labels. So sometimes we use certain labels, like for example, in my culture, like the first word stubborn, we use the word ziddi. I don't know if you guys have that, you know, similar language. So this idea that like, oh, a certain child is like very ziddi, that means like they're very stubborn. And, you know, it's an automatic negative connotation that we put onto our kids. So there are many of them here, right? So they're wild, distractible, picky, demanding, manipulative. Even I've heard babies being called manipulative. That's kind of how they're designed, right? They're supposed to communicate with us to manipulate our behavior, but described as in this negative sort of framing that we're putting. Explosive, nosy, loud, argumentative. So again, these are what we might think of as like, you know, characteristics that we don't like or don't want, or we need to fix, change, control. So what are ways that we can use new labels, because these new labels allow us to express some curiosity about what's actually happening under the surface. So, you know, we're labeling our child as ziddi or stubborn, but, you know, what if we, like imagined that, you know, this child is actually incredibly assertive, willing to persist in the face of difficulties, knows his mind, knows what he wants. Later on, when we're really worried about peer pressure, what is that child going to be doing? When all the other kids are going along with whatever anybody else said to do, that stubborn child, guess what? They're going to be the one who's like, no, why should I listen to what you're saying? Let me think for myself. And so, you know, I'm pointing that out to show that like sometimes the characteristics that bother us when our child is small, like we may not be realizing that those same characteristics can serve them later in life. Of course, they don't make our life easier because nobody wants a child who argues with them, right? But if we recognize where that's coming from, that they maybe have a sense of personal power, or they have a sense of wanting to decide for themselves what's right and wrong, then we can make room for that, right? We can make room for creating situations and conversations where they feel that they have a choice rather than they feel that they're being forced or oppressed or trampled on. So there are many examples like that. So I'm just picking on stubborn, but for example, it's another one we can look at. You know, anxious or nervous. Sometimes if you yourself are someone who has a stronger personality, maybe we get triggered by a child who seems too anxious or too nervous. And we worry about that, and we feel like, that's not healthy and they need to toughen up. But what if we, label that as cautious? This is someone who, we're taught in our religion to be in this world, to have taqwa and like gather our garments around us as if we're going through, bushes with thorns, so that we don't, end up making a mistake. So what if we think about the reason why our child may be anxious, why they're being cautious, why they're being careful, how this may serve them in their life, rather than, again, making it into a negative. So this is just an example of, kind of this idea of good versus bad. How can we look a little bit more with objective eyes at some of the characteristics our children have, rather than automatically labeling them as negative characteristics. This is one of my favorite books, and this is just the cutest picture, so I chose this one. Raising Our Children, Raising Ourselves. So this is by Naomi Aldort. The reason I really liked this book is this is not a manual that tells you how to raise your kids. It's a manual that tells you how to stop and listen to your inner voice. So it's not telling you, if you do X, Y, and Z, your kids will turn out like this. Or if you don't like what your kids are doing, you should do this, and then they'll stop doing it. Because there's a lot of books like that, right? Especially when your kids are young. It's like, 1, 2, 3 Magic, or behavioral, change books, how to get your kid to sleep through the night, how to get your kids to do this or that. So those have their purpose and their place. But when I was reading a lot of parenting books, I ended up preferring books that empowered us to actually look within. And so this is one of those books. And, her main point in this book is that, if we don't step out of our cycle of reactivity, we'll continue intergenerational trauma. We'll continue to just repeat the cycles of whatever we heard when we were young, and without thinking, we'll just keep replaying the same ideas and messages. And when we behave in a reactive way with anyone, not just our kids, we're short-circuiting that ability to truly connect. Because when you're reacting, you're not even connected with yourself. Like, think about yourself when you're angry, frustrated, triggered. You're not really connected with yourself. You sort of feel this sort of agitation. And so, her book talks a lot about stopping and pausing. And this is really important, right? Because, even Islamically, if we want to restrain our ego, we can't just do exactly what our ego wants right when it wants to do it. So when you're in a situation where you're about to react, the advice she gives has to do with stopping first, taking a deep breath, and even imagining what you're about to say and do, and what the impact is going to be on your child. And usually we sort of know what the impact is, but we do it anyway. Whatever it is that we're used to doing, maybe we're repeating something we always repeat, or maybe we're reacting with a certain emotion or tone. And often the result of reactive behavior is that we sever the connection with our child. And of course, we can always repair that. So it doesn't mean that, always walking around in a very present, peaceful state. But it's giving us tools to basically stop that process in its tracks, and then think about, what would be the result if we continue in a reactive way, or what would be the result if we stop and choose a different way. So that's a lot of what I remember from this book, but I recommend it, not even just for young kids, but for older kids as well. So I want to talk about what are my patterns. So this presentation is about understanding our child, but actually it's really important to understand yourself too, because there's an interaction happening between you and your child, right? So if you don't understand both sides of the reaction, you're going to be missing some of the picture. You're going to have a big blind spot. So that's why, you'll find parents will be taking their child to the therapist and saying, fix the child, but the therapist has to look at the whole family system. But oftentimes, people don't want to look at the whole family system. They just want to look at this isolated problem or behavior without really recognizing what is the whole structure that's happening around that child, because nothing is in isolation, right? There's this beautiful quote from, I think it was Yellowstone. It says, I think it's John Moore, who says, if you try to pick out anything in the universe, you'll find it connected to everything around it. And so the same thing with the child, like children are not in a vacuum. They're constantly taking in different stimuli. We now know that children carry with them, I think, like DNA and RNA from not just their parents, but their grandparents. So intergenerational issues, conflicts, politics, all kind of live on. from one generation to the next. And so it's just important to recognize there's interconnectedness, that nothing is ever just on its own. So if we're able to study ourselves, so studying our own temperament, our own personality, whether through temperament, Enneagram, or even other tools that you might come across, how can this help us? How can we be more introspective about ourselves? Are we reflecting on how our own upbringing has shaped us? And can I sense the difference between when I respond and when I react to my child? What does it feel like in either scenario? So maybe just take a moment to reflect on this question, and anyone who wants to answer it. Are you able to tell the difference between when you're reacting and when you're responding to your child? So anyone is free to respond to that question. And what does it feel like? How do you know?
I think I know when I'm responding instead of reacting is I'm not judging. I'm standing in a place where I can see them for who they are, not how they relate to me. So it's not about me.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you can feel that. You can feel that difference. You're standing in a place you're not actually kind of fully in the situation, but you're sort of standing a little bit apart from it. Yeah, that's great. Anyone else want to share if they're able to kind of note some difference between how they respond or react?
Can I speak? Is anybody else talking? No? Okay. So I think with the kids, right? Like I think they, like you said, the word reaction. Our kids are more scared of our reaction, of what mommy or daddy is going to react like, rather than what you said. Like, look at them. If something has gone wrong, like I want to take an example. How we react to what has happened. Like I forgot my homework. Honestly, the first thought that comes is, how can you forget your homework at school? But then what I've learned practicing, I'm still practicing, is okay, what happened? How did you forget the homework at school? So I think that the kids are more scared of your reaction than the questions you're going to be asking.
Yeah, that's a great example. So like your child does something, your first reaction might be to say, how could you do this, right? Or like there's an immediate reaction, and maybe some of it is based on, oh, I used to be that way and I don't want my child to be that way. Or, oh, I was never like that. What's wrong with you? Like I never had this problem. So like, whatever it is, sometimes it's not just the situation that we're reacting to, we're reacting to some significance that we're giving the situation of, oh, you can't even remember your homework, then that must mean X, Y, and Z, or that must mean I've made a mistake in X, Y, and Z. So you can start to see how one small thing that is going on can start to represent bigger things that we may be afraid of. Yeah, so just generally the difference between responding and reacting is something we can often feel in the body. So we may or may not be very kind of in tune with our bodies, but we can often feel what it feels like to be responding, to be reacting in a situation where we feel a little bit out of control, that we actually can't stop ourselves. Like maybe we don't even want to say what we're saying. Like we're about to say something that we know is hurtful or that we know is not going to help the situation, but it's almost like we can't help it. That's when you're in a reactive state. And same with a child. If you think about a toddler having a tantrum, they're in a reactive state, right? So you can't really talk to them, reason with them. You have to sort of calm them down. And that's what they teach now. You have to calm down the animal brain. You can't even talk or explain at that point. You have to wait till that calmness has descended on the child. And then later you can talk about what happened. So the same with us. When something gets triggered, we can go into a reactive state. And so the best weapon that we have is actually time. And time is literally, could just be 5 seconds. And so the book I mentioned is filled with examples where, parents were able to successfully press pause. And just in that 5 to 10 seconds, something would switch in their mind, or they would realize something. There's a great story where a tired mom went to take a nap before a dinner party, and she was about to make lasagna to take to a potluck. So she wakes up and comes into the kitchen, and her child has opened up all of the ingredients and dumped them all into a pan. And she says, look, Mom, I made the lasagna. So basically she kind of like ruined all the ingredients because she wasn't supposed to mix them together. So the mom's first reaction when she saw the mess was like rage of like, oh my God, like now how am I gonna cook this in time for the party? But then she waited a moment until her daughter spoke, and her daughter said, you know, I did this because I didn't want to wake you up because I wanted you to get more rest. And so just that moment that she waited, just that 5 seconds, she went from a state of like kind of rage and anger and frustration to complete like melting compassion. And that changed how she saw the situation, right? So it's the same situation, but she's now seeing it from a different vantage point, seeing it from the eyes of the child. And so, you know, that's just an example of like how a little bit of time, a little bit of perspective can change like how we're interacting with our child. Just check the time. Okay. So examples of automatic patterns that we might be falling subject to. So there's many different patterns. This is from one of my Enneagram books. These are different patterns that people generally might have going in the background all the time. So for example, resisting what is. This is a pattern where we are always feeling like there's something wrong. So somebody is not doing what they're supposed to be doing. A situation is not what it's supposed to be. We're constantly feeling that there's something we have to fix, change. It's never okay. It's never just everything's fine, everyone is okay. We're looking for something that needs to be corrected all the time. Another example of an automatic pattern, worrying. So always worrying, no matter what it is, what information we get, it triggers some type of worry of what could go wrong in the future, anxiety. Another example is judging. So we're constantly judging perceived flaws and thinking about how to fix them. Keeping busy. So we talked about this. Maybe we're always avoiding stillness. Like we're never still. We're always, you know, jumping from one thing to another. We're never just like allowing ourselves to like sit and have a moment of reflection or to kind of be in a slower, more present state. I would say, you know, in today's life, I don't know anyone who can avoid this particular pattern because it seems to be the pace of our life. Becoming aggressive could be a pattern. So for example, you know, often or, you know, as a default, raising the voice to gain attention or control, or avoidance. So just kind of moving away from situations that we actually need to take action or we actually need to pay attention. Maybe we choose to ignore, walk away, not see what needs to be seen, just sort of denial. Over obligating oneself. So maybe scattering ourselves around everywhere so we don't actually have focus or attention. We're just always feeling scattered. So these are just examples of automatic patterns, not necessarily related to parenting, but you can see how if someone is operating with this pattern always in the background, how is that going to affect how you interact with your child and what message that you're sending your child? Anyone want to comment on any of these patterns? Does anyone relate to any of them or want to make any comments or questions? What's so funny, Shima?
What is your advice if you do all of these?
I was gonna ask that. Oh, no.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, we're all human, right? So whatever our personality is, we're gonna have some degree of all of this going on, but for some of us, some things more than others. For example, the person who's aggressive might be different than the person who's avoidant, you know, although sometimes we can toggle between the two. And yeah, so they're all, I'm sure they're can relate to. I chose ones that I think a lot of us can relate to. Anyone else?
I wanted to mention, I think it's nice because if you recognize like where your opportunity is, you know, in this kind of reactive state, you know, I sort of replay it for myself. So like if I know a scenario is coming up with someone, you know, daughter or whoever else it is, you have to try to kind of like, you know, sort of preempt yourself so that you know how to sort of maneuver around it. So if you know you're going to have that kind of a reaction, you know, what can you do? It's almost like, I mean, it's almost like rehearsing it a little bit, you know? So in that reflective state, I think age and wisdom and, you know, living can teach us all that. But yeah, it kind of resonates. But in terms of like tackling them, I'm not perfect at any of them, obviously, but Yeah, I think when I see, I can replay something that's happened in the past, and I'm like, oh, that didn't turn out so well. I didn't feel good. They didn't feel good. Then I can sort of change the behaviors to influence the outcome better. So I don't know. That's what resonated for me when I saw the chart there.
Yeah, no, I love what you said about rehearsing, and that's kind of what the Naomi Oldort's book talks about, is press pause and play out what you know is about to happen next, because you already know, because it's already happened before usually. And before you let that movie play out, let's see if you can switch the channel and look at what would a different movie look like if I didn't go with my knee-jerk reaction. Instead, I allowed myself to see with a new eye, to interpret with a new eye, to act from a place of love, compassion, even for oneself, because a lot of times, the things that we're directing outward have to do with what we're experiencing inward. Because, the message of why is my child behaving badly? There could be an underlying message of, why am I not a good mom? Or like, why are my kids, acting out? Or, maybe I haven't been tough enough. Maybe I haven't been, loving enough. So there's, a lot of our internal things that get mixed in to our reactions to our child. Okay, so I'm going to look at something else. So this is called examples of triggers. So again, with different personalities, there are different things that can trigger us. And these are for adults too, right? This is not just for kids. And this also relates to the different Enneagram styles that I was mentioning, the 9 types. So these are examples of triggers. And the reason I'm mentioning this is sometimes we may not realize that the environment might be triggering our child, whether how we're speaking to them or how someone else is speaking to them. And, we might interpret it as, disrespect or bad behavior, or, like I said, being stubborn, ziddy, aggressive. But being aware of your child's triggers can help you manage them better, right? It doesn't mean that you're giving power over to them or that you're taking a back seat, but you're just noticing what else is in the environment. So for example, being told to do something that you don't want to do, there's some children who experience that as a trigger, where they feel a loss of autonomy. So they might even refuse to put on their shoes before they're going out the door, or to do, any small action that needs to be done, because for some reason at that moment they're feeling disempowered, or they're feeling that they're being pushed in some way. So now that you know that information, how do you respond to that, or how do you create a situation where maybe a different outcome can occur? Feeling unseen or unheard, feeling rushed. I mean, how many of us can say that we've never rushed our child, right? Because we're always trying to get them somewhere. So that could be a trigger for a child, just feeling the anxiety of being rushed. Feeling taken advantage of, being lied to is a big trigger for some people. For other people, it's not. Communication that's too vague, for example, giving instructions, but they're not actually very clear. And so that creates confusion or anxiety. Communication that's too blunt, maybe it sounds harsh or rude to a certain temperament, right? Not having choices or feeling trapped, dealing with someone else's anger. So for example, an adult yelling in the next room, that could be a trigger for a child who's in a different room, but they're just hearing that and they're just absorbing the energy from that anger. It can be a big trigger if anger is something that they're afraid of. So these are just examples. Again, these are for adults as well, but it's something to, one of my kids, this is very interesting. So the being lied to, my brother-in-law was doing a magic trick, and my daughter was watching when she was, I think, around maybe 5 or 6 years old. And it was a trick where he would take a picture and then show it to the child, and like somebody was missing from the picture. But the way he was doing it was he had 2 pictures. And so he was showing this trick. It was something about like a magic blanket or something. If you put it on someone, you become invisible. So he did this trick with my other 2 kids, and they were kind of like trying to figure it out. But when he did this trick to my youngest daughter, she kept asking, what, like, how did it happen? And we just said it's magic. And she started crying and crying, and she was so upset. And then, later we just realized that like she really didn't like the feeling that the adults in the room were, to her knowledge, they were lying. They were saying something that wasn't true. They were not explaining to her the truth. She knew that there was a truth, and we were not sharing it with her, and it made her feel very upset. So, just an example of, that wasn't necessarily what we would consider a lie, but feeling somehow that your trust has been broken. And it could be as simple as, you know, you promised something and that didn't happen. And that's also a prophetic teaching, right? Like, don't promise your children something and not do it, because then what are you teaching your children about the value of your words and your commitments? And of course, you know, again, we can't always, sometimes we have intentions and, you know, we said we were going to go to the park, but we ran out of time. So that's different. But if we continually kind of tell our kids' children and they feel that we're not, you know, following our words with actions, that can be a trigger as well.
I
Okay,
have a
so,
question.
oh, sure, go ahead.
I have a question on the previous slide, and I know the focus of today is in relation to parents and children, but you also said that this could be viewed in the light of adults, right? And their temperaments and how they perceive situations.
Yeah.
So this is probably a loaded question, and I apologize. But what do you do then? Like, for example, if you look at communication that is too blunt. So what if there's an individual who struggles with that kind of communication? Or I don't know, being lied to. Or so what does an adult do first to come to terms with it themselves before they then try to wholly be present in their parenting and, you know, not to pass on their baggage to their child?
Mm-hmm. So for example, the example is if the child is triggered by communication that's too blunt and you're the one who's communicating, or
No, what if the adult themselves is a person who gets triggered by communication that's too blunt or has trouble dealing with someone else's anger?
yeah,
Mm.
yeah, that's me. So if you listen to my podcast, you'll learn a little bit about my my style. So for example, you know, type 9 on the Enneagram is called the peacemaker. Very afraid of other people's anger, very troubled by any type of perceived aggression, or blunt communication can often be perceived as aggressive or unkind or rude. And so if you know that's a trigger for you, for me, studying the different personality types and communication styles was really helpful, because it allowed me to understand what's happening behind the behavior rather than interpreting it in the way I was interpreting it, which was either you're a bad person, you're rude, you don't like me, you're angry, you're upset. Whereas somebody who has that communication style, so that's like, for example, type 8 on the Enneagram, they are not communicating that way with those intentions. They're communicating that way because that's their automatic pattern. So their automatic way of being in the world is to be straightforward, honest, what we would maybe, what others might interpret as blunt or rude, for them is a way to be honest, straightforward, and direct. They're actually triggered by people who are too nice, too wishy-washy, smiling in your face, but maybe not saying the truth. That's their trigger. So, you know, as Hamza Yusuf says, like, you know, somebody else is a test for you. Guess what? You're a test for them.
Yeah.
That's the nature of this world. And so for me, studying the different types and communication patterns helped me come out of, first of all, out of a place of judgment of like, well, this is bad and wrong. And I'm not talking about abusive communication, right? Where somebody is like, you know, really using abusive language or really yelling and screaming. I'm talking about just those nuances. So for me, I think the trigger doesn't fully go away because we're human, right? And so we may choose to maybe not be around certain people who like trigger us in a certain way because it just, that trigger keeps happening. Or if it's a close relationship, we might start to understand like, oh, okay, this is the way this person interacts. And it doesn't mean what I used to think it means. And sometimes that allows us to like read between the lines, and maybe develop a little bit of a thicker skin around, you know, that type of communication. So again, it depends on also like the environment that we're in, how common it is. For example, a child who is very sensitive, who grows up in a family where everyone has that communication style, they're actually going to end up getting a little tougher because of the environment that they're in, but their core personality still would prefer to maybe have a different communication style, but because they were raised in a certain family or a certain culture, they've sort of learned to deal with it. So that's one example of that.
Thank you.
Welcome. Okay, so I'll do a couple more slides. I know we're past 8 o'clock. So I'm not going to teach all the styles of the Enneagram. That can be something that we learn later, but I wanted to just mention this. Something that we can be aware of is what are the fears and motivations of different styles and types. So again, if you get into studying this, you'll understand this more, but this is just a useful thing to think about. What is driving our behavior? What are we afraid of? So this shows different things that different styles might be afraid of. Like, what if I'm wrong? What if I do the wrong thing? I'm really afraid that I'll do the wrong thing. Or what if people don't see me and appreciate me? That makes me feel bad. Or what if I fail? What if I don't get 100 on the test? I only got a 97. I'm going to be a failure. What are my parents going to say? What are my, how am I going to face myself if I don't, really exceed and excel? There's an anxiety there. Or I don't want to be ordinary. I don't want to be like everybody else. That's my greatest fear. I don't want to be like all the other kids in Islamic school. I don't want to be like all the other kids on my block in my family. I want to be different. I'm afraid that I'll lose my individuality or competence, or I don't want to be limited. I don't want people to limit my options and say, this is the only career I can have, or this is the only, way I can behave. Like I want to have some more freedom. Or vulnerability. I don't want people to see me cry. I don't want anyone to know that I have soft feelings, or that I'm scared, or that I'm weak. I want to always present myself in a way that I'm kind of tough, I'm in control, or conflict. I'm really afraid that somebody will yell at me, or that there'll be anger involved. So I'm always going to avoid conflict no matter what. So these are all different fears that can play into, again, this is for adults and for kids. But the more we know about ourselves and know about our kids, the more we can kind of have compassion around these fears that might be in the background, driving certain behaviors that maybe are healthy or not healthy, depending on the situation. Maybe I'll stop with this slide. So how to make me feel seen. This is just some of the content that you can also find online. This is also based on the Enneagram, which, I mentioned, I just particularly like this system because I've just learned a lot from it. So there's a lot of commonalities if you look at all these different things. So how to make me feel seen, sit with me when I'm still, let me process without interrupting, hug me, look me in the eyes, expect nothing, stand beside me while I dream, stay with me when I'm unsure, listen to me, really hear me, especially when I'm quiet, commit to authenticity with me in conversation or silence, give me space to process and gentle permission to unwind, be there for the good, stay as I dig deeper at my own pace, join me on my mission, whatever it is, gently check in by committing to be present with me. So these all have a similar flavor, have to do with kind of be quiet, get still, and be with me, right? So that's what every child needs. Sometimes we think they need a lot of our, correction and instruction and lecturing, which, they undoubtedly need our guidance. And that's what, one of our primary purposes. But they also need to be able to relax in our presence, to feel safe, to feel seen. And that's something that we can, inshallah, all provide to our kids, regardless of, their personality or temperament, or regardless of ours. And sometimes some kids only let us do this, at 10 o'clock at night when they're lying in bed, and maybe they finally will tell us something about their day. Or maybe we have kids who, as they get older, right, they may not necessarily allow us to get vulnerable with them the same way that they were when they were on our lap. But sometimes we can find ways or moments in which they allow us to kind of go into their world and be with them. Okay, I'm gonna see if there's anything else that I wanted to share. So I'm actually gonna stop this share for a second and see if I want to go to the end. So I have a lot of slides here going through different types of personalities, but we won't have time for that. But I'm happy to share some of this with you. Okay. I'm gonna share the screen one more time. So just leave this up like this.
Sister Najiba, I was suggesting to Sister Shima that we do a more, like you have the material, we do a more detailed session after Ramzan, maybe if you're free
Yeah, sure.
eventually.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. It's definitely a topic I enjoy talking about. So these are just some of the reflection questions that you can think about. What is our family constellation of archetypes? How does this create a unique group energy in our family? So this is more after going through the different archetypes, which we did not do today. But it's great to have a map of like, oh, okay, well, these are the archetypes of, the parents. These are the archetypes of the children, maybe even the grandparents and the uncles and aunts. And so you start to see, every constellation creates a different energy in a family. So what's the energy of our family? How do we interact with each other? What is my way of being in the world? How do I impact my environment and relationships? So again, self-study. What were my parents' personalities? How might that have influenced my development? So just looking at, again, and some people do this on a mega level by doing genograms, and then they study themselves, they study the generation before them, what was going on politically, culturally in the generation before them, how did that impact their parents, then how did that impact their kids? So this is a big area of study that some people get kind of geek out about in terms of understanding their own family, and it's used in medicine actually. So whenever you go to the doctor, they ask you, right, tell me your medical history of your mom and your dad. Like, why do they ask you that? Because it's relevant. So the same thing with like therapy, intergenerational issues. People often, fail to think about the connections, but it's important to think about, what were some of the struggles that my mom had or my dad had, whether it's, financial or emotional or cultural. And, how are some of these things reflected in maybe not us, sometimes things, skip a generation, right? So there's things that are relevant to our family. These are things I can share with you later. So these are some Enneagram books that I recommend to people generally if you want to learn more about the different personality styles and how they're relevant. These are a couple of books on parenting, so understanding your child, how different children have different needs and how you can be a little bit more aware of that. These books are a little bit easier, more fun, have like kind of comics in them, so they're kind of funny. I like these. And then I'll just end with this one, which is, personality is different than ethics, right? So I think we're worried for our children more about their ethics rather than we shouldn't be worried so much about why do they have a certain personality, but how are they going to take the personality that they have or the characteristics they have and act in the world. So, make it a point to study Islamic ethics as a family so that whatever their temperament is, whatever their style is, that is being guided and molded towards a prophetic character rather than us giving our children the message that there's something wrong with them or that they're bad or that they need to be, sort of changed or corrected in a way that to them feels like we're doing violence to their being. And unfortunately, often religion is not taught that way, or it's taught in a way that can induce feelings of like badness or shame, which ultimately doesn't help us grow into prophetic character, but rather, kind of that gentle correction, encouragement is inshallah what will help our kids embrace prophetic character. And of course ourselves, right? I mean, for me, I think the best thing, I'll stop the share for a sec here. The thing that's been most impactful for me is actually being in the presence of people who have prophetic character and, kind of being exposed to that energy and that temperament. That's been the most impactful thing rather than, being lectured or scolded, which, again, as adults, we don't like that. And so just thinking about, how can we create environments where our kids are growing and they have the supports they need regardless of the personality that they're coming with. Okay, so I'm going to end there, inshallah, and we can move to discussion. And I'm happy to stay for, however long people want to talk, inshallah. So thank you.
I'm going to turn off the recording just so people can ask their questions without the fear of being on YouTube.
Okay.